Chapter 8, Section 1. And the big idea here is that under our federal system, the executive, the legislative, the judicial branches all share the responsibility of governing the nation. And in particular, when we talk about the courts, we're going to learn their particular responsibility power system. And so a few terms that we'll see today. Circuit courts. These are the state federal courts. There were 13 when they were originally created. Jurisdiction, meaning who has power over what. And we'll see some various examples of this. And then the first question I've got is, do you think, and I can imagine, I feel like I know how most of you would answer this, do you think that everyone is treated equally in the United States? Now remember that we have a law that says everyone has to be treated equally. But we have a law. It says it. It's there. It's in the Constitution that everybody should be treated equally. But does that mean that everyone is? No. So we can't change the law. That's not going to fix it. Because why? Well, it already says treat everybody equally. We're already supposed to do that. But the reality is we don't do that. So we have the courts. And it is their job to make sure that our nation's laws are justly enforced. That's their primary function. So let's talk a little bit. The federal courts are the third branch of the U.S. government. There's the executive that we did earlier, the legislative was last week, and now the courts. The purpose, and they are the judicial branch of the government. The purpose of this branch is to use the law, the existing laws, to settle disputes. Civil disputes are a particular type of law. Like, for example, if a parent or guardian co-signs on a vehicle when you buy your first car, and between when you buy that car and decide to sell that car someday, that relationship gets broken. And let's say they refuse to sign over the title. What rights do you have? Well, it's not a crime for them to refuse to sign over the title. But you now have a car sitting in your driveway that you need to get rid of. How are you going to do it? Well, legally, you got to take them to court. You can bug them, you can harass them, you can go drive the vehicle onto their property, you could set it on fire somewhere, drive it off a cliff, but most of those suggestions are illegal. The legal recourse is to take them to the court. But here's the problem. They haven't broken a law. All they've done is refuse to sign your paperwork. That's a civil case. And guess what? That's part of the judicial system. They have to hear your case. And then finally, of course, guilt or innocence of crimes. That's criminal law, and we'll get to that soon. But the U.S. Supreme Court is the highest court. So it's all based around this idea of equal justice, because once more, when you go see the Supreme Court, the statue with the blind lady holding the balanced scale, the idea of equal justice. Everyone, all American citizens, as per the 14th Amendment, have the right to equal protection under the law. And that's been interpreted by the Supreme Court in Escobedo v. Illinois to say that you have a right to a lawyer even if you can't afford one, and that your innocence is assumed until your guilt is proven with a preponderance of evidence. That's another legal term, a preponderance of evidence. It means that it is absolutely confirmed that you did that bad thing. You have every right to ask for a formal review of that case. Just like when you're pulled over and you're given that ticket, you have every right to contest that ticket. Now, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I read the Constitution and I'm proud to be an American. But then I watch the news and I get disgusted. Because the idea is beautiful. The reality is that equal justice is hard to achieve. We all have prejudice. We do. Let's be honest. Now, I know prejudice is usually interpreted as racism, but it's more than that. I mean, yes, some people are racist, some people aren't. I mean, again, there's spectrums there, but prejudice means that we have preconceived bias. Jamie likes his blue shirt. He has a bias towards his blue shirt. Yeah. But also there's the trouble of money. You know, when Mark Zuckerberg, yeah, you guys saw this not too long ago, right? Mark Zuckerberg had to go to trial. Anybody remember what he had to go to trial for?
Like censoring Facebook or something like that?
Yeah, it was the trouble of Facebook and how it was being used to spread misinformation, and all of Facebook was in trouble because there was just a lot of there were some problems with the system. Well, guess what? When he was on trial, it was televised. He had a super nice suit on. He had a fancy set of lawyers behind him. He had the best of the best representing him. Now, when I got pulled over for speeding and was given a ticket, no fancy suit. I mean, I had like a shirt and tie that I borrowed. And no fancy lawyers. I just did a lot of Googling and represented myself as best I could. Because I couldn't afford legal help. Now here's the thing, I could have requested a state lawyer. I didn't feel it was necessary in that case because it was a minor offense. But I certainly couldn't have afforded my own lawyer. Heck, the only time I've ever gotten a lawyer was when I bought a house, because you have to have one to sign the paperwork, and that was too expensive. Okay, so equal justice, unfortunately, is difficult to achieve. Beautiful theory, the practice is tricky. But what does the Constitution say about these courts? Well, a lot about the courts is detailed in Article 3 of the Constitution. It established a national Supreme Court. This gives Congress the power also to establish lower federal courts. For example, the Judiciary Act of 1789 created the 13 district courts, meaning that there's a federal court in every state. Speaking of, passed in 1789, the same year Washington was elected. And this established those federal district courts. And the circuit that they represent, the circuit is an area of jurisdiction. It's bold for a reason, folks. And also the Court of Appeals. Because once more, until you get to the United States Supreme Court, you can always ask why. Then at that point, you're just done. You know, you can always ask why, but they are the highest court in the land. Everything else can be. Now, the federal appeals courts were created officially in 1891. And there's 3 different levels to the federal court system. So first off are the district courts, the ones in your particular state. You can appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, once more, we're not talking about going before the judge in Henderson County. We're talking about it is now a federal issue, dealing with the interpretation of a federal law. That's the only time you're going to be in a district court. So you're either in really big trouble or you're contesting what you see as an injustice at the federal level. Now, you might see an injustice at the local level. You might see, like, let's say, one day I was driving up in Balsam Grove and I saw property, and it was there were containers of chemicals that weren't stored properly, and I observed those chemicals washing off into the North Fork of the French Broad. That's a problem for me because I spend a lot of time on the North Fork of the French Broad. I float that river a lot, and I saw these dangerous chemicals spilling into a river that I spend a lot of time on. I told a friend, they told the courts, and they contested a local injustice. I don't know what happened from it, but the idea there is that they contested it locally. Again, that's an issue for the local courts. Now, were it a federal case, like for example when the Pigeon River was polluting to the degree that no living thing could exist in the Pigeon River, well, that related to the Clean Water Act, passed in 1965. That's a federal case, because here was a company polluting and a state was not enforcing. And so the EPA got involved, a federal agency challenged Blue Ridge Champion Paper Mill at that time in Canton, challenged them in federal court. I'm sure they appealed it at the federal level, but they finally had to clean it up. The final authority here is the Supreme Court. I don't think the pigeon went to the Supreme Court, but it definitely was contested at a big level. Those are the three levels. Now the next question is, who hears the case? Who has the authority? You know, for example, if you commit a crime in Transylvania County, unless it's a federal or state crime, if it's a local crime, I don't know, you speed, you run over a stop sign, I mean, it's going to be enforced locally by Transylvania County sheriffs, even though you live in Henderson County. It's going to be heard locally because it's their jurisdiction. Again, the question of jurisdiction. That means who hears the case, who has the responsibility. Federal courts are only dealing with issues related to the Constitution or federal laws or disputes between states. Once more, you are unlikely to have to deal with this issue because most of your stuff will be handled locally. But if you have a complaint regarding the interpretation of the Constitution, like say for example, when in 1896 an African American gentleman sat in the front of a train. Yeah, there was an 1800s version of Rosa Parks. And he was told to leave. And he contested it because he said, well, the 14th Amendment says that I have equal rights under the law. Doesn't that mean I should be able to sit where I want in a train? And the court said no. They said that the 14th Amendment does not guarantee integration and that segregation is not a violation of equality before the law. So that man, even though it happened in a particular place, it dealt with a national issue. And then finally, citizens from different states or the federal government. You know, say you have a grievance against the federal government and you choose to challenge said grievance through the legal process. Well, then absolutely, it's going to be heard by a federal court. Say, for example, when another African American gentleman in 1856 had served as a slave for a man in the Minnesota territories, if memory serves. And when his owner passed, he sued for his freedom. And of course, the courts told him no. It's an unfortunate case. It's a landmark case. It's often heralded as the worst decision of the United States Supreme Court in their history, but it still was a federal issue. And yes, the United States Supreme Court or federal courts hear cases between foreign governments and the interpretation of treaties. Like, let's say that the United States had agreed to the Paris Protocols. The Paris Protocols were an international treaty where nations around the world agreed to reduce carbon emissions. Guess what? We said no on that one. But had we said yes, then we would have been liable and accountable to the rest of the world to reduce the level of pollution that we put out. Yes, federal courts deal with Admiralty and maritime laws. You know, if you ever take a cruise that departs from North or South Carolina, it's really fun. It's a great vacation. Food's good. Nothing like sitting on a beach chair for a week and doing nothing. I'm a fan. But you know, when you get out to international waters, there's an announcement that comes on the speakers that says, "We're now in international waters, woo!" And everybody goes, woo! And suddenly the casino is open, the drinks are pouring, and everybody starts having a good time. Why? Because it's international waters. The rules are a little different outside of the state of North Carolina. Now, certain rules still apply. You have to be 21 to consume adult beverages. You have to be of a certain age to play in the casinos, etc. Those are federal laws. And the ship is still bound to said federal laws. But they're not bound to North Carolina laws anymore. North Carolina laws say you can't have a casino. And so the casino opens up. Yay! Okay. Next, U.S. diplomats. U.S. diplomats are tried or represented directly in federal courts. So if a diplomat were to run over an old lady in Henderson County, that case is not heard in Henderson County. It goes directly to the federal courts. Okay, so the question is, who hears the case? That's jurisdiction. But there are certain cases where federal courts have the exclusive jurisdiction. And this is where, there are definitely some cop shows where this has happened. A diplomat does a bad thing. It doesn't get heard in that local court. The federal courts have that exclusive jurisdiction. You know, if a crime is committed on international waters, I'm sure you've seen the movies where people try to commit murder and then dump the body over. Those crimes are heard in federal courts. Why? It's a federal case. Why? Because it's not within the boundaries of any particular state. It occurred in international waters. Well, guess what? Murder is still a crime, even if you're floating in the middle of the Atlantic somewhere. And if you're an American citizen, you're still tried in an American federal court. So don't go floating out with your friend and pushing them overboard. Yeah. There's the issue of concurrent jurisdiction. This means that the state and the federal court both have the authority to hear this case. Case in point, about a year ago, the serial killer that was on the loose in Pisgah Forest ran through Pisgah in Transylvania, kidnapped a man in Mills River, and fled and was not caught until McDowell County. So he fled through at least 4 different counties that we know of and had committed murder on multiple occasions. Now here's the point. Murder is a state crime. Yeah, it's in there. Don't commit murder in North Carolina. It's obviously a crime against the state. It's also a federal crime. It's in there pretty clearly in federal law somewhere. Don't commit murder. Well, guess what? The federal and state courts both have the authority in this case. Now, in that particular incident, it was chosen that he would stand trial in North Carolina and in South Carolina because he'd committed murder in both states. And he was sentenced separately in both states. And they wanted to do it that way. And the federal government cooperated with the states because they wanted to punish him as severely as they could. They wanted to make sure that he was locked up and never set loose. Also, in a case involving a large sum of money, those disputes could be heard by a federal court, or could also be heard instead at the state level. So, in terms of federal cases, I don't know. It's a matter of trying to figure out which is most important. Is it the cases involving the interpretation of the Constitution, federal laws, disputes? The Constitution is still the highest authority